The engine quit on a Tuesday. Not with a bang, not with smoke or fire or any of the drama you might expect from a machine that had given 31 years of its life to the same 480 acres of Illinois bottomland. It just stopped, like an old dog lying down in the yard and deciding quietly that it had gone far enough. But here's what you need to understand before I tell you the rest of this story. That engine quitting wasn't the disaster. The disaster was what happened to the man who was counting on the other machine. Let me tell you about Champaign County, Illinois, in the autumn of 1987. Champaign County sits in the dead center of the state, and I mean that almost geographically precisely. It is the kind of flat that takes your breath away, not because it is beautiful in any dramatic sense, but because the sky there is simply enormous. There are no hills to interrupt it, no tree lines thick enough to push it back. You stand in a field in October in Champaign County and you feel like you are standing at the bottom of an upside-down ocean, the blue going up and up and up until it swallows you whole. In 1987, the corn stood at 11 feet in some of those fields. The Illinois Corn Belt was still healing from the farm crisis years, 1983, 1984, 1985, 3 years that had chewed through family farms like a combine through dry stalks. Banks had called loans. Neighbors had lost land that their grandfathers broke sod on. There was a quietness over certain farmyards that had nothing to do with peacefulness and everything to do with defeat. The smell of October harvest in Champaign County is something you don't forget if you've ever stood in it. Diesel exhaust and cut corn husks and that particular sweetness of turning earth, cold now, the warmth of summer gone out of it. The dust from the combines hangs in the low afternoon light like something holy, golden, and slow, drifting over fields that stretch to the absolute edge of the visible world. It was into this landscape, this particular October, this particular golden dust, that two brothers drove their machines in opposite directions and made choices that would define the next 20 years of both their lives. Their names were Harold and Eugene Schieffer. And this is their story. Let me tell you about Harold Schieffer first, because Harold is the one this story is really about, even if he'd be the last man on earth to say so. Harold was 53 years old in the fall of 1987. He was not a large man, 5'9" in his work boots, with the kind of build that farm work makes over decades, lean in the legs and thick through the shoulders, hands that looked like they'd been carved out of something harder than skin. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, pale gray, the color of November sky, and a habit of squinting at the horizon that had put deep lines at the corners of both. He had graduated from Urbana High School in 1952, gone one semester to the University of Illinois on a partial scholarship, and come home when his father, Otto Schieffer, had his first heart attack. He never went back. He never talked about not going back. If it was a wound, he'd cauterized it so long ago that not even his wife, Lorraine, could find the scar. Harold had farmed alongside his father for 26 years. He knew the Schieffer land the way you know the inside of your own house in the dark, by feel, by memory, by 1,000 small disasters survived and repaired. He knew which field drained slow after a wet spring. He knew where the tile line ran shallow under the northwest quarter and where you had to watch the three-point hitch or you'd clip it. He knew because his father had told him and his father's father had told his father that the creek bottom ground, 80 acres of it along the Little Vermilion, could grow corn that would make a grown man cry from sheer gratitude if you timed the planting right and didn't push it. He drove a 1956 Farmall 400, his father's tractor. Its red paint had gone the color of old brick in the places where 40 Illinois winters had done their work. The serial number, if you looked it up, dated it to the tractor works in Rock Island, one of the last great gasoline farmalls before IH went full diesel on the big row crop machines. Harold had rebuilt that engine himself, twice. He knew every sound it made. Now let me tell you about Eugene. Eugene Schieffer was 49 years old, Harold's younger brother by 4 years, and he had what their mother used to call the gift of confidence, which was her gracious way of saying that Eugene had never, not once in his adult life, walked into a room without believing he was the most capable person in it. He wasn't a bad man, I want to be clear about that. He wasn't cruel in the way that some men are cruel, not cold-blooded, not calculating. He was something more ordinary and in some ways more dangerous. He was a man who had been right often enough that he had stopped being able to imagine being wrong. Eugene had done well in the 1970s when land prices were rising and credit was cheap, and every ag lender in the state was practically pushing operating loans across the desk at farmers. He borrowed aggressively, expanded aggressively. and because the 70s rewarded that particular combination of nerve and timing, he had come out ahead. He drove a Buick Riviera. He had a satellite dish in his front yard the size of a small silo. He took his family to Florida in February. When Otto Schiefer died in the spring of 1987, he left the family farm, 480 acres, a set of aging grain bins, the house, and 2 outbuildings, split evenly between his 2 sons, 240 acres apiece. Eugene had a plan before the funeral was over. He sat across from Dale Hutchins at First Farmers Bank in Champaign 3 weeks after they buried Otto, and he walked out of that building with a $94,000 operating loan and a handshake. And 2 weeks after that, on a bright April morning, a flatbed truck pulled into the long gravel lane of what had been the Schiefer family farm and unloaded a brand new John Deere 4850. 2-wheel drive, 190 horsepower, green paint so new it still smelled like the factory. The kind of machine that stopped men in their trucks on the county road to get out and walk the fence line for a closer look. Eugene had paid $87,500 for it, financed at 11.2%. He stood next to it in the farmyard with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops and a smile on his face like a man who had already calculated the ending and liked what he'd found. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone make a decision, watched them make it with total confidence, watched them drive away satisfied, and felt somewhere in your gut a quiet dread that you couldn't fully explain? That feeling has a name in farming country. They call it watching the weather. And the old farmers will tell you, the worst storms are always the ones that come in from the direction you weren't watching. The confrontation, when it came, didn't happen in a lawyer's office or across a property line with a survey crew. It happened the way most confrontations happen in farming country, slowly, in public, in front of people who would remember every word. It was the 4th Saturday in September 1987. The Schiefer brothers had come to the same conclusion about the same week. It was time to start harvest. The corn had dried down to somewhere around 16% moisture, maybe a touch wet, but the forecast was showing a dry stretch, and you didn't wait on a dry stretch in October in Illinois. That Saturday morning, Harold had driven his tractor out of the machine shed and was hooking up his father's two-row picker, a 1959 International 234 corn picker, the pull-type kind, older than most of the men who were watching. He was methodical about it, the way he was methodical about everything. Check the gathering chains, grease the husking rolls, make sure the elevator chain isn't stretched past service. Eugene pulled into the yard, driving his 4850. He didn't get out right away. He sat up in that big, sealed, air-conditioned cab with the tinted glass, and he looked down at Harold crouched beside the old picker, and then he got out. Harold, he nodded. Eugene, Harold nodded back. There were 3 other men in the farmyard that morning. Ray Kowalski from the neighboring section, who'd been friends with Otto since the Korean War. Tom Detmer, who ran the elevator in Rantoul and had driven out to talk bushel price. And a young man named Kevin Brandt, barely 22, who worked part-time for both brothers and was beginning to understand that this was a situation requiring careful silence. Eugene walked a slow half-circle around the old farmall and the picker. He was not sneering, not quite, but his expression had the quality of a man making a diagnosis. "You're not going to harvest with that," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "That's the plan," Harold said, without looking up from the elevator chain. "Harold," Eugene said his name again, the way you say a name when you're trying to be patient. "That machine is 30 years old, the picker's even older. You've got 240 acres of corn to get out. You know what the window looks like this year." "I know what it looks like." "Then you know you can't do it with that." Harold stood up, wiped his hands on a rag he kept in his back pocket, a red shop rag worn to fraying at the edges. He looked at the 4850 the way a man looks at something he has already fully considered. "I'll manage," he said. Ray Kowalski, God bless him, tried to change the subject. He said something about the basis at the Rantoul elevator. Tom Detmer started to answer him. But Eugene wasn't finished. "I'm going to tell you something, Harold, and I'm telling you because you're my brother and I don't want to watch you lose this place like the Hendersons lost theirs." He paused. "That old iron is going to cost you this harvest, and if you lose this harvest you lose the operating year, and if you lose the operating year you lose the land. You understand what I'm saying?" Harold put the shop rag back in his pocket. "I understand what you're saying, Eugene." I'll rent you time on the 4850, reasonable rate. I'll even let Kevin run it so you don't have to. I don't need your machine, Harold said it quietly, no anger in it, no wounded pride, or if there was, it was buried so deep it didn't reach his voice. I know what I'm doing. Eugene looked at him for a long moment, then he looked at Ray Kowalski, then at Tom Detmer, the elevator man. Ray, he said, you want to take that bet? I say Harold's got corn still in the field come Thanksgiving. Ray Kowalski did not take the bet, he looked at his boots. Tom Detmer studied the horizon. Kevin Brandt found something to do behind the grain wagon. Eugene laughed, a short, genuine laugh, not a cruel one, which somehow made it worse, and climbed back up into his 4850. The engine started with a sound like a contained thunder, smooth and powerful and new. Harold watched him drive out of the yard, then he went back to checking the husking rolls. Now, and I want you to hold this question. Here's what none of those men standing in that farmyard knew. Here's what Eugene Schieffer, sitting high in his new cab with his 11.2% loan and his absolute confidence, did not know. Harold Schieffer had not chosen the Farmall 400 because he couldn't afford another option. He had not chosen it out of stubbornness or sentimentality, or because he was, as Eugene privately believed, simply not a modern man. He had chosen it because of something his father told him, something Otto Schieffer had learned the hard way in 1956 and never forgotten. And what that something was, we'll get to that. First, let's talk about what Eugene's first week of harvest looked like. Eugene Schieffer put his John Deere 4850 into his north field on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon he had covered 60 acres. The machine was extraordinary, there is no other word for it. It moved through the standing corn with the smooth indifference of something that didn't know it could fail. The yield monitor, one of the first in Champaign County, ticked up bushel counts that made Eugene feel like a prophet. He called Dale Hutchins at the bank from his kitchen that evening. He talked about yield projections. He talked about the following year's expansion. He talked the way men talk when they believe the future is already written and they're the ones who wrote it. But here is what was happening in Harold's field on that same Monday. Harold had started at first light, not with the Farmall 400, not yet. He had spent an hour before the sun was fully up walking the creek bottom ground, his 80 acres along the Little Vermilion, walking it the way his father had taught him, the way that looks to an outside observer like an old man being slow. He was not being slow, he was reading. He was reading the residue on the soil surface, how it lay, whether it had crusted, whether the ground underneath had the firm but yielding quality that means the subsoil is right. He was reading the color of the lower corn leaves, the way the stalks stood, the angle of the ears. He was doing what 40 years of watching that specific ground had taught him to do. He was looking at the field not as a set of acres to be harvested as fast as possible, but as a living system that would tell you, if you listened, exactly what it needed and exactly when. What Harold knew, and this is the knowledge, the thing I told you we'd come back to, was this. The creek bottom ground on the Schieffer farm had a clay pan. 18 inches down, right beneath the dark topsoil that grew the magnificent corn, there was a layer of compacted clay that water couldn't easily penetrate. Otto Schieffer had discovered this in 1956 when he pushed a heavy tractor through that field after a wet September, and compacted the subsoil so severely that the following year's yields dropped by 31 bushels per acre on that ground. He'd had it tile drained since, and the tile helped, but the lesson, the permanent, cellular memory lesson, was this. You do not put heavy iron on the creek bottom when there is subsurface moisture. The Farmall 400 weighed 6,100 pounds. Operating weight with the two-row picker came to roughly 9,400 pounds. The John Deere 4850 weighed 18,500 pounds. With a corn head and loaded grain tank, you were putting 26,000 pounds on that clay pan. Harold had walked the creek bottom that morning because he needed to know something specific. Was there residual moisture at depth? The surface looked fine. It had been dry for 10 days. But Harold knew, because Otto had taught him and Otto had learned it from 31 years of watching that ground, that the creek bottom held water longer than the surface suggested. You had to walk it. You had to feel whether your boot pressed down differently in certain spots. You had to look at the color of the exposed soil at the tile outlet. What he found on that Monday morning was what he expected to find. The surface was ready, the subsoil was not. He went back to the farmyard and hooked up the Farmall. He started in his upland acres, his north and east fields, the ground that drained freely, the ground you could push. He ran the Farmall 400 through those fields with a precision that Kevin Brandt, who was watching some days, would describe years later as something close to artistic. Harold didn't run a straight line and come back. He read the field as he went. He adjusted his speed through the low spots. He watched the picker chains with a calm attention that came from knowing exactly what sound preceded a problem. The Farmall 400, with its gasoline engine rebuilt to factory specification, put out 51 horsepower on the belt. Against the 4850's 190 horsepower, this sounds, and in most conversations it is, a laughable comparison. But Harold was running a 2-row picker, not a 6-row corn head. His throughput per row per hour was not catastrophically different from Eugene's. His efficiency advantage came from somewhere else entirely. It came from not stopping. The 4850, across the fence in Eugene's field, stopped 11 times in the first week. Twice for hydraulic issues. The new machine was still being worked in and there were 2 fittings that the dealer's mechanic had to come out and receipt. Once because Eugene pushed it through a low corner of his east field after a light rain and the heavy machine started to track sideways on the wet soil, and he had the sense to back off before he did real damage. Twice for fuel, the 4850 burned through diesel at a rate that meant frequent stops at the nurse tank. The Farmall stopped once. Harold had found a hairline crack in the upper husking roll housing on the 3rd day. He'd welded it himself in 45 minutes using a welder his father had bought in 1961, and he was back in the field before noon. By the end of the first week, Harold had harvested 89 acres. Eugene had harvested 94 acres. The gap was 5 acres. The new machine was marginally ahead. Eugene was satisfied. He would not be satisfied for long. The rain came on October 14th. It came the way Illinois rain comes in October, not dramatically, not with thunder and lightning, but as a kind of steady, gray, methodical commitment. It rained Tuesday. It rained Wednesday. On Thursday morning it stopped, but the sky stayed the color of old pewter and the ground had taken on 4 inches of rain in 3 days and was, in the language of the fields, done. Harold spent Thursday cleaning the picker, checking his combine. He had an old 1972 International 715 combine that he'd used later in the season, sharpening tools, doing maintenance on the grain dryer. He was not worried. He had 89 acres in the bin. His upland ground was done. What remained was the creek bottom, and the creek bottom, he already knew, would not be ready for the machinery until the subsoil had time to drain. Eugene spent Thursday on the phone. His north field had 12 acres in a low pocket that he'd passed over, planning to come back. Now those 12 acres were sitting under an inch of standing water. His east field, the one where he'd had the close call with the wet corner, had a 60-acre section that he could not get the 4850 into without risking the kind of compaction that could take 3 to 5 years of yield drag to recover from. He was behind. He called Dale Hutchins. He called the dealer about the hydraulic issues. He called his crop insurance agent, which was premature but told you something about his state of mind. The county road past the Schieffer Farms was a gravel road, Township Road 2000 East, and in October in Champaign County the farmers watch each other's field progress the way sailors read the weather constantly, and with a professional interest that is not quite envy and not quite judgment, but contains elements of both. Word travels in farming communities at a speed that has nothing to do with telecommunications. Word was traveling about Harold's progress. Word was traveling about Eugene's delay. Ray Kowalski, who was Harold's neighbor to the east and had watched this family for 40 years, drove past the Schieffer places 3 times that week. He saw Eugene's 4850 sitting in the farmyard, its green paint darkening in the October rain. He saw Harold's Farmall in the equipment shed, clean and waiting. He saw Harold himself on Friday afternoon after the clouds began to break, walking the creek bottom again. He stopped his truck. "How's it looking, Harold?" Harold stood at the edge of the field and considered. He pressed his boot into the soil. He looked at the tile outlet, where the water that was draining out of the ground told you more than a moisture meter if you knew how to read it. "Monday," he said, "maybe Tuesday." Ray nodded. He looked across the fence at Eugene's truck, parked by the idle 4850. Eugene stuck. "Eugene's got a good machine," Harold said, and he said it without irony, without satisfaction. He said it as a plain fact because it was. Ground's not right for it right now, that's all. Ray nodded again. "Otto used to say that," he said, "about that creek bottom." "I know," Harold said. "I was there when he said it." Now let me stop here and ask you something because I think this matters. We live in a time when power is worshipped, when the biggest, fastest, most expensive answer feels like the only real answer, when newer always means better and more horsepower is always the solution. Have we lost something? Have we traded a certain kind of knowledge, the slow, specific, irreplaceable knowledge of particular ground, for a general capability that doesn't always fit the particular problem? I'm not asking rhetorically. I want you to sit with that question because what happens next in this story depends entirely on which side of it you come down on. Harold Schieffer put the Farmall 400 into the creek bottom on Monday, October 19, 1987. The ground was not perfect. It was better than Eugene's heavy machine could handle, better by a margin that made all the difference in the world. Harold's 9,400 combined pounds moved over that clay pan ground with a lightness that the 4850 could not have approached. He could feel through the seat of the tractor, feel the way you feel things in a machine you know intimately, the way you know the road through a car you've driven 10,000 miles, the difference between firm ground and ground that was giving. The Farmall's gasoline engine had a sound like a working man's heartbeat, even and dependable. Not smooth in the way the new diesel was smooth, the Farmall had its own personality, its own cadence, but Harold had been listening to that cadence for 20 years and he trusted it the way you trust your own breathing. He ran 12 acres on Monday, slow, methodical. He circled the lower spots rather than pushing through them, coming back to them later in the afternoon when the October sun had done what it could. He watched the corn come off, yields that the yield monitor on Eugene's machine would have reported digitally, but that Harold calculated in his head from elevator tickets and bin fills the old way, and what he calculated told him that Otto had been right. This ground, handled correctly, grew corn that justified every bit of care you gave it. 83 bushels per acre on the low end, 97 on the high. On ground that had been farmed the same way for 60 years, no subsurface compaction, tile drainage maintained religiously, the soil structure preserved by the simple practice of not putting more weight on it than it could bear. He ran Tuesday, he ran Wednesday. On Thursday, October 22nd, Eugene's ground was finally dry enough for the 4850, and Eugene came out of the farmyard at 6:15 in the morning in a mood that Kevin Brandt, who had been working for him that week, would later describe as focused in a way that was a little frightening. Eugene pushed hard. The 4850 could cover ground at a pace that the Farmall simply couldn't match on the open fields, and Eugene ran it at full capacity. He was behind and he knew it, and he was a man who responded to being behind by pushing everything harder. By Thursday evening, Eugene had done 40 acres. By Thursday evening, Harold had finished the creek bottom. Harold drove the Farmall back to the equipment shed in the dark, with the last of the October light gone from the sky and the temperature falling toward frost. He backed the picker into the shed, engaged the park brake, shut off the engine. The silence after a gasoline engine shuts down is a particular silence. The valves tick as the metal cools. There is a smell of exhaust and warm oil that is, to anyone who grew up around farm equipment, one of the most honest smells in the world. Harold sat on the tractor for a moment after the engine stopped. Just sat. The way you sit in a chair at the end of a long day, not because you can't get up, but because sitting feels right before you do. He had 240 acres of corn in the bin. Every single acre. Kevin Brandt, who had stayed late helping Harold weigh the last load at the grain wagon, watched the equipment shed light go off and the farmhouse light come on. He stood in the farmyard for a moment, not quite knowing what he was feeling. Later, he would say he felt like he'd watched something he was supposed to witness. Eugene Schieffer finished his harvest on November 3, 1987. He lost 14 acres in his low east pocket. The standing water had been there too long and the ears had dropped. His combine picked up what it could, but the loss was real, calculated later at $1,847 at the elevator price. He had pushed the 4850 hard on his remaining ground, and there were, the following spring, yield drag results in 3 fields consistent with subsurface compaction. Not catastrophic, but measurable. He had also, in the pushing, developed a hydraulic line failure in the 4th week that cost $340 in parts and a day and a half of downtime when he could not afford either. The net on Eugene's harvest year after operating loan service at 11.2% after the equipment payment, after inputs, after the losses, the net was $3,200. Positive, barely. Harold's net was $19,400. Let me tell you about the day Eugene found out. Not from Harold. Harold never told him, never brought it up, never said a single word about it directly. Eugene found out at the grain elevator in Rantle, in the way things come out in those conversations between men who are keeping careful track of each other's loads. Tom Detmer, the elevator manager, was not a gossip, but he was a man who worked with numbers and who respected what numbers told you, and when Eugene came in to talk about his final tally, Tom had a way of listening that made men want to tell the truth about what they'd actually brought in. Eugene did the arithmetic himself, sitting in his Buick Riviera in the parking lot of the First Farmers Bank, waiting to talk to Dale Hutchins. He sat there for a while. The morning was cold. November in Champaign County is not gentle. The fields were gray stubble under a sky the color of old pewter. The parking lot of the bank was empty except for a pickup truck and a woman getting into a Caprice with a baby. Eugene sat and looked at the fields across the highway. He was thinking about the Farmall 400. He was thinking about Harold crouched beside the picker, checking the husking rolls. He was thinking about what he had said, "You can't do it with that," and how he had said it with absolute confidence, and how that confidence had been so complete that he'd looked for Ray Kowalski to agree with him. And Ray Kowalski had looked at his boots. Eugene had thought at the time that Ray was uncomfortable with confrontation. He understood now that Ray had been looking at his boots because Ray had known. Ray was Otto's age. Ray had watched this ground for 40 years. Ray knew about the creek bottom and the clay pan and what Otto had said and what Harold knew and why Harold was going to be fine. And not one of those men in that farmyard, not Ray, not Tom Detmer, not Kevin Brandt, had said a word to correct him. They hadn't needed to. Eugene sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Then he got out of the car and went in to talk to Dale Hutchins about restructuring the equipment note. He didn't call Harold that night. He didn't call him the next night either. He called him on a Saturday, about 2 weeks later. He called and said, "How'd you end up?" And Harold said, "Okay, how about you?" And Eugene said, "Okay." And that was all they said about it. Two brothers, 40 years of shared history in 3 words. But Eugene Schieffer, who had never in his adult life been able to imagine being wrong, was quiet in a way his wife noticed. She asked him about it 3 times before he answered. And when he answered, he said something she would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "I think I didn't know what I didn't know." Let me tell you what happened in the years that followed, because a story that stops at the silenced parking lot tells only half the truth. Harold Schieffer farmed his 240 acres through 1997, 10 more years, and in those 10 years he was never more than a middling success by the standards of the industry publications. He never expanded. He never bought new iron. He rebuilt the Farmall 400's engine a 3rd time in 1991, this time with his son David, who was 19 and who would later become one of the most sought-after equipment restoration mechanics in central Illinois, partly because of what he learned in that equipment shed. What Harold did in those 10 years was take care of the ground. He kept the tile lines open. He planted cover crops before cover crops were fashionable. He watched his rotation. He applied inputs based on soil tests, actual soil tests, not estimates, because Otto had taught him that the ground would tell you what it needed if you asked it correctly. His yields were not spectacular, but they were consistent. Year after year, on ground that was not compacted, not mined, not pushed beyond what it could sustain, Harold Schieffer got yields that were, when you averaged them across the decade, within 4% of his county average, while spending less per acre on inputs than 80% of his neighbors. He retired in 1998. His son David and his daughter-in-law Karen took over the operation. They still farm the Schieffer Creek bottom ground today. The yields on that 80 acres after decades of careful management are among the most consistent in the county. The Farmall 400 sits in David's equipment shed. It runs, David starts it 3 or 4 times a year, not because he needs to, but because some things deserve to be kept in running order. Eugene Schieffer's story is more complicated, and I want to tell it honestly because Eugene was not a villain. He was a man of his time, a man shaped by the 1970s expansion, by the culture of biggeries, better that the land-grant universities and the equipment manufacturers and the ag lenders had all sold together as a single package. He was not wrong that the 4850 was a capable machine. He was wrong about something more fundamental, and it took him the better part of a decade to understand what it was. He restructured the equipment note in 1988 and again in 1990. He sold 40 acres of his ground in 1991 to cover an operating shortfall, 40 acres that had been in the Schieffer family since his grandfather broke it in 1903. That sale hurt him in a way that the financial statement didn't capture. He sold the 4850 in 1993 and went back to smaller equipment, a used John Deere 4240 that he bought from an estate sale for $22,000 and which, he admitted to Ray Kowalski, was more machine than he needed for what he was doing. He did not lose his land entirely, and I want to be clear about that. The remaining 200 acres he never got back to 240 he held. He farmed it more carefully after 1991. He took soil tests. He watched his water. He talked to Harold more than he had in 20 years, and those conversations, Ray Kowalski said, were different in quality from the ones before. Less pronouncement, more question. Eugene Schieffer died in 2009 at the age of 71 of the same heart condition that had taken Otto. He died with his land, his 200 acres, intact. He left it to his daughter, Patricia, who farms it today with her husband through a cash rent arrangement with a larger operation. Patricia has a photograph of the 4850 on the wall of her office. Not as a monument to success, she knows the whole story or most of it. She keeps it, she told me once, as a reminder of what confidence without knowledge costs, of what listening to the right people at the right moment, even when you don't want to, is worth. And Kevin Brandt. Kevin Brandt, who was 22 years old in that farmyard in September of 1987, who found something to do behind the grain wagon when Eugene looked for someone to share his certainty. Kevin Brandt went on to farm 1,800 acres in Champaign County by 2005. He is considered one of the most sophisticated soil health operators in the region. He runs equipment sized to his ground. He tile drains extensively. He has never, in 30 years of farming, pushed heavy iron onto wet ground with a clay pan. He will tell you, if you ask him what he learned from Harold Schieffer, that the most important thing he learned had nothing to do with machines. It was this: know your ground like you know your own people, what it can take, what it can't, what it needs, what it's given you, and what it's trying to tell you. He said Harold told him that the day after the harvest was done, standing at the edge of the creek bottom in November. He said Harold said it the way people say things they've heard their whole lives and have finally verified with their own hands. Let me tell you what I think this story is actually about. It is not about old machines versus new ones. It is not a polemic against progress or John Deere or borrowed capital or any of the tools of modern agriculture. The 4850 was a magnificent machine. The men who designed and built it were engineers of real ability. Eugene Schieffer was not a fool for buying it. What this story is about is a particular kind of knowledge, the kind that cannot be downloaded or financed or delivered on a flatbed truck. The kind that lives in the body of a man who has walked the same 80 acres for 30 years in every weather and every season. The kind that is transmitted not in classrooms but in October mornings at the edge of a field, watching a father read the ground before committing weight to it. Otto Schieffer lost a year's yield on that creek bottom in 1956. He lost it because he pushed a heavy machine onto wet clay pan ground, and he learned, in the irreversible way that the land teaches, what that decision cost. And then he told Harold about it. And Harold listened, not because Harold was passive or incurious, but because Harold understood at some level that his father's mistakes were a gift. That 31 years of watching the same ground had produced a knowledge that was worth more than any owner's manual, any yield monitor, any extension service bulletin. We live now in a time that worships data. Yield monitors, GPS guidance, soil sampling grids at 2.5 acres, satellite imagery, drone scouting. These are not bad things, they are genuinely useful. But there is a data point that no satellite can capture: the feel of particular ground under a particular man's boot after a particular rain, assessed by a mind that has been reading that ground for 40 years. That is not something you can finance. You accumulate it the way you accumulate anything truly valuable, slowly, imperfectly, through error and attention and the willingness to be taught by what the land does when you're wrong. Harold Schieffer was not a heroic figure in the dramatic sense. He did not ride his old farmall into a triumphant sunset. He was a quiet man who did quiet work on ground he understood, who saved his harvest not through some spectacular act of nerve, but through a lifetime of accumulated listening. He would have told you if you'd asked him about it, and you would have had to ask carefully, because Harold was not a man who advertised his philosophy. He would have told you that it wasn't the machine that saved him. It was his father. It was 1956. It was a mistake that Otto had made on that creek bottom 31 years before and had never stopped paying attention to. It was the transfer of that attention across a generation in the form of something as simple and irreplaceable as a father walking a field with his son and saying, "Watch here, this is what I got wrong, don't make the same mistake." That kind of inheritance doesn't show up on a balance sheet. But it shows up in the yield every year, quietly, without fanfare, without a new coat of green paint. Let me pause here one final time and ask you this. What has someone in your life tried to teach you, patiently, practically, from experience that you didn't fully hear until later? What ground are you walking that someone before you already knows? And is it possible that the most valuable machine in any operation is not the most expensive or the most powerful, but the one you understand completely? Because that Farmall 400 is still running in David Schieffer's shed, that's not sentiment, that's craft. That's what happens when knowledge and care and attention are applied to something over a lifetime. The ground is still there too. The creek bottom along the Little Vermilion, 80 acres of it, still growing corn that makes you grateful, still being walked before the heavy iron goes in, still being read the way Otto read it, the way Harold read it, the way that knowledge moves from hand to hand across time when we are humble enough to carry it. Let me close by saying this. Harold Schieffer, Eugene Schieffer, Otto Schieffer, Ray Kowalski, Kevin Brandt, these are fictional characters, composites drawn for the purposes of this story. But Champaign County, Illinois is real. The farm crisis of 1983-1985 was real. The International Farmall 400 and the John Deere 4850 are real machines, with the specifications described here accurate to the period. The challenges of clay pan soils, subsurface compaction, and harvest timing in the Illinois Corn Belt are documented agricultural realities that shaped the decisions of tens of thousands of actual farming families during this era. The lessons in this story belong to all of them. Historical context is real. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling purposes. End card. The forgotten farmer telling the stories that the history books skipped. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you know a story from your own family, leave it in the comments. We're listening.